bottom of the page. 32 is lave, heart. Hashem wants the heart of the Jew. Our heart should be into it. Right, so on 32A, 32A4, on the right side of the page. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer im Omar Sholosh Sholosh Mikulam Yotzev. Yochanan ben Nuri says, morning, Adam, welcome back. If you said, Adam, even though we officially start at 45, we decided we're going to get a little head start today. We're starting right now, perfect timing. We're on 32A4. The Mishnah stated that there's a certain amount, I'm going to get out the Shulchan Aruch on this. Let me get out the Shulchan Aruch. The Mishnah stated there's a certain amount of verses, sukkim, that we need to say in the Amidah, in the Musaf, that discuss kingship, discuss shofar, discuss zichronot, discusses God remembering. And the Mishnah stated that you need a minimum of 10. The Mishnah stated 10 verses that discuss kingship of God, 10 verses that discuss zichronot, talks about God remembering certain things in history, and 10 verses that discuss, one of the things that Hashem remembers, Zacharti lo chesed nuraya, the great kindness that we did. We left Egypt, we went into the desert, a place, there's no food, and we follow God, right? God remembers, that's a great merit for the world, for the Jewish peoples. So we talk about shofar. We have verses that talk about shofar. The shofar, morning Jack, the shofar of Har Sinai, the shofar of Mount Sinai, different the shofar that David HaMelech talks about, the praising of Hashem. We talk about different verses. We use different verses from Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim that we evoke, and all these verses will bring a great merit for the Jewish community when you talk about these things on Rosh Hashanah. The Mishnah stated there's a minimum. There's a minimum of 10 verses that have to talk about kingship, 10 verses that have to talk about remembrances, and 10 verses that have to talk about shofar. That's what the Mishnah stated, which would be a total of 30 verses. The Mishnah states you can't have less, which means you could have more, but you can't have less. Now in Shulchan Aruch, in Tav Kuf Tzadik Aleph, take a look in the opening up the Shulchan Aruch, Tav Kuf Tzadik Aleph, says the following. He says, we say 10 psukim of kingship, 10 psukim of zichronot, 10 of shofar, in each bracha in the middle brachot of the Amidah, right, of the Musaf, right? I get double what Adam, I say Adam, I get two people on the deal, right? In the Musaf, we have the middle brachot, bracha number 4, 5, and 6 contain 10 verses from each item, and 3 of them are Torah, 3 of the verses are Ketuvim, 3 are Nevi'im, and then the last one ends with Torah, number 10. And the Shulchan Aruch said if you want to add more than 10, you're allowed to. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. So now, but the Mishnah has that machloket. The Mishnah said, the Mishnah opens up and says, so the Mishnah says you have to have 10 psukim. And then the Mishnah said you can't have less than 10 psukim. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that if you said three from each section, 3 it says Im Omar Gimel Gimel Mikulam you Yotze. If you said three from all, you were Yotze. And now the question is, the Gemara wants to understand, what does he mean when you said three from each? There are two possibilities to understand. Does that mean that you said three psukim for Malchiot, three verses for Zechronot, and three for Shofar, which would be a great difference between 10 and 3. The first opinion says you have to have a total of 30, minimum of 30 psukim, 10 of kingship, 10 of Shofar, 10 of Zechronot. And the second opinion says, no, you only have to have minimum 9 would work, 3 by Shofar, 3 is by Malchiot, 3 Zechronot. You don't have to have 10 on each, 3 on each would do. 10 to 3, right? Specifically on Rosh Hashanah, that there's a special halacha, and also I think we saw maybe on the Yom Kippur, we have to see more about the Yom Kippur Shemona Esrei on Yovel, the special Jubilee year when Yovel applied. But regarding us, for our practical for us, practically today, it's only Rosh Hashanah. Only Rosh Hashanah we have this phenomenon that we have to mention in the Amidah, in the Shemona Esrei, we have to talk about God's kingship. There needs to be verses of kingship, verses of remembrances, and verses of shofar. And all of these things are on Rosh Hashanah because it's very connected to the holiday Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is where we focus on the kingship of God. Hamelech, recognizing God as king. He's the king. We are the servants, and therefore we have to act properly. We want, and by us talking about his kingship, that will be a merit for us. By us talking about shofar, Hashem will remember us, the merits of the shofar, all the different verses that talk about shofar. And also we talk about zechronot, talk about remembering, God remembering the binding of Yitzchak, remembering the acts of the Jewish people, the proper acts of the Jewish people, and all evoking those verses will serve as a good for us, as a be successful on Rosh Hashanah in our day of judgment. So, but the first opinion says you have to do 10. He doesn't talk about if you didn't do 10. Morning, Morris. It's great to see you. He says you got to do 10. The second, Rabbi Yochanan says no, you don't need 10. You need 3 is good enough. So what is now? The question is, when you say 3 is good enough, does that mean let's talk about kingship, verses of kingship. The first opinion says you need to do 10 verses. And the second opinion is saying 3 is enough. That's one approach. You don't need 10 verses of kingship, 3 verses. Now, if you do 3, what would that be? Morris, we are on 32a4. So if you do 3, that would mean 1 verse from the Chumash, the Torah, 1 verse from the Nevi'im, the prophets, and 1 verse from something we call the Ketuvim, the things that are referred to as the written the Ketuvim, the writings. 3 would mean 1 from each of those sections of, right? The Torah is that something it's called Tanakh, right? If you want to refer to the whole Torah, you refer to it as the Tanakh. What is the Tanakh? Tanakh is an acronym. The Taf stands for Torah, the Nun stands for Nevi'im, the prophets, all the prophets like Yeshaya, Yirmiyah, all those prophets. And then the Ketuvim refer to the writings like Shlomo HaMelech, writing of Mishlei, what we call Megillat Esther is Ketuvim, Iyov is Ketuvim. So certain things are called Ketuvim, the writing, certain things are called the prophet. And then we have the Chumash, the Torah itself. So we need it, we all know what a cholent is, right? We need a cholent that's made up of many, you have traditional cholent, that's potatoes, beans, and meat, right? A lot of people have barley or other beans, and you have meat, and you got meat, barley, and what else we got? Meat, barley, and potatoes. That's the cholent, right? And what now you have multiple things. If I'm going to have a lot of people like to have cholent on Thursday night, right? So right, in Mars, right? People, I don't know if you know about that. In the Ashkenaz world, a lot of people like to go out to have cholent Thursday night before Shabbat. They're already getting into the spirit, like the pre-game, people have pre-game. This is the pre-Shabbat. Thursday night, they go off a cholent. That's the halachic. What do you do when you say you eat cholent? Now, you have barley. Barley is mizonot. You got to say mizonot on the barley. Now, the potatoes are not little slivers of potatoes, nice sized potatoes that are also get a bracha. They're not like, and then the meat is also. Welcome back, Simon. Welcome back. Bruchim habayim. Bringing back the holiness of Eretz Israel to the Holy Land to us. We're so happy to see him. I heard you were back. Isaac, yes. They told me. I was here Wednesday. It's very nice. Yes, Shana Rabbah. Morning. So we have each one. There's a cholent, but if in order to have a good, so each one gets it. You have an also. If you have a nice piece of meat, you'll say a shako on the. So you have three different main foods. They're not like tafel. Like if you have a bowl of cereal, right? Let's say you have a cereal. You have a bowl of cereal. You make the bracha on the food that's in the cereal is the main food. The milk is secondary. You don't make a bracha generally on the milk. If I'm going to have Rice Krispies for breakfast or Cheerios for breakfast, I'm making mizonot on the Cheerios. I don't make a bracha on the drink because the drink is the water, the liquid that's inside is secondary. But when it comes to cholent, let's say the way I'm explaining, there's three main ingredients, three main things that are eaten separately in a certain sense. You'll make a separate bracha on the three ingredients. We need three ingredients, Simon, to make a good cholent. Certain things in life, if you're missing some ingredients, technically you might need some salt or whatever. I'm not a cholent maker. Stuff you need ingredients. So there seems to be a menu of ingredients on what you need to say on Rosh Hashana, that Adam was talking about, specifically Rosh Hashana. And what is that menu? That menu consists of kingship, shofar, and remembrances. They're called malchiot, zechronot, shofrot. That's the menu. Those are the three items that we need to have. Now, those three items, how much do we need? How much salt do you need for the cholent? How many verses do you need to mention that talk about God's kingship? How many verses do you need to talk about the remembrances of God? How many verses do you need to go ahead and talk about the shofar? So the Mishnah opened up. You're supposed to have 10 on each. 10 verses talk about kingship, 10 talking about remembrances, and 10 talking about shofar. Total of 30 verses. And even in those 10 on each section, kingship, under the title kingship, we have 10. They're also going to be divided from not just the Chumash. It's those 10 are going to be from Chumash, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Morning, Daniel. Great to see you. So we're on the Gemara Rosh Hashana, 32a, 32a4. We're talking about the Amidah of Musaf. Amidah of Musaf, where you have to go ahead and say certain verses that will serve as a merit for the Jewish people. So now we're saying there's 10 verses of kingship, of Malchiot, 10 of Shofar, 10 of Zechronot. The Mishnah stated that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, if you said 3, instead of saying, you said 3, you're good. There's 2. Now what does 3 mean? Doesn't mean, instead of saying 10 for kingship, you said 3 for kingship. Instead of saying 10 for shofar, you said 3. And for zechronot, you said 3. So there's a difference of 30 to 9. Right? The first opinion says you have to 10, 10, 10. 10 of kingship, 10 of zechronot, 10 of shofar. And he only said 3 of each. Or does he mean when he said 3 of each, means that within kingship, instead of saying 10 verses of kingship, you said 3 from the Chumash, 3 from the Nevi'im, 3 from the Ketuvim, within kingship, but you didn't say 10. You said 9 instead of 10. How far is he arguing? Sometimes, good morning, Asaf. Sometimes when a person speaks, when the rabbis of the Mishnah, they spoke very short. And when they said what they said, that generation understood what they meant. But we later on, as the generations went, they had questions. What did the rabbi mean when he made that statement? It's not clear to us. So that's the Gemara's question. What did the rabbi mean when he said, if he said three, it's good? Does he mean you made three total on kingship? Or three means within kingship, I said three from the Chumash, three verses of kingship from the Chumash, three from the prophets, three from the Ketuvim, which I did a total of 9 instead of doing a total of 10. That is the question. Is it that if you did 3 instead of 10, we did 9 instead of 10? That's the Gemara's question. How far is the dispute between what is the meaning of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? And that's why we're opening up today on 32A4. If you look on the right side, if you said 3 from all of them, yotzei, you fulfill your obligation. So in the yeshiva, in the Beit Midrash, they wanted to understand, what does the rabbi mean? What does he mean? What is the meaning? Does he mean when you said 3 from all of them? Does he mean shalosh min Torah? You said 3 verses from the Chumash, shalosh min Nevi'im, 3 from the Nevi'im, shalosh min Ketuvim, Davi Teisha, which means you did a total of 9. Vike b'nai echada. And the whole difference between the two opinions of the rabbis are one verse. That the first rabbi says you have to do 10 verses on kingship, and the second rabbi says no. If you did 9, you're all right. Meaning you should have done 10, or the Gemara, or Dilma perhaps, echad min Torah. This opinion holds that not that you said 3 from the Chumash, 3 from the Nevi'im, Tuvim on kingship. You only said 1 from the Chumash, 1 from the Navi, 1 from the Ketuvim on the subject of kingship. Instead of saying 10 verses on kingship, how many you do? 3. That's the second approach. But what were the 3? You had a challenge. But one verse was from the Chumash itself, the 5 books of Moses, which we just completed on Simchat Torah, or one from the Navi, like we just read from Sefer Yeshua, and one from Ketuvim, which is 3. Which is a total of 3 verses. And then there's a great argument between the rabbis. That one said you have to have at least 10 verses on kingship, and the other rabbi said you only need 3, total of 3. Remember everybody, when we say 10 verses on kingship, right? How do we do it? It's broken up. We have 3 we have a total of, that 10 is mixed between Nevi'im, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. So the Gemara says, I'm going to bring you an answer to the question. You have a question. So what am I going to do? I'm going to bring you another statement from the rabbis, and that other statement from the rabbis will shed light on this statement of the Mishnah. You got that, Asaf? Tashma. Come in here. The Tanya. We learned it in Breita. The Breita says the following: Ein pochtim me'asara l'malchiyot. You can't have less than 10 verses that talk about God's kingship. By the way, and the number 10 we said earlier is a very big number, right? Why 10? We said one reason is it says God said 10 statements. Baruch she'amah, we're going to say Baruch she'amah soon, right? Baruch she'amah v'hoy olam. And God spoke, and the world was created with 10 utterances, right, Daniel? God said there should be light, there was light. There should be, vegetation, there's vegetation. There should be birds, there's birds, right? There's different, whatever Hashem said, Hashem said certain statements, and the statements created the world. That's what the 10 represents. That's one opinion. The other opinion, the 10 represents the 10 commandments that were given at Sinai. And those 10 commandments, there was the shofar. That's 10 commandments. And therefore, we want to go ahead and connect to that. Therefore, we need 10. By the way, I saw brought down Shabbat. How many candles are you supposed to light on Shabbat? In honor of Shabbat, before Shabbat. Some people do 2 candles. Some people do 7. Some people do how many members of the family. And some do 10 candles in honor of the 10 commandments. They want to connect with that great Daniel. How do you like that idea of 10 candles? Just be careful. A lot of kids, just be careful. It's a beautiful thing. As long as you be safe, no problem. Just, and People have large families. A lot of people who are according to members of the family, they can have 10 kids. Oh, okay. And so, so now the Gemara says the following. Ain't Toshma. We learned in the Braita. Ain't Pochtim. It's the last line of 2 lines of the page. Ain't Pochtim me'asar machil. You cannot have less than 10 verses that talk about God's kingship. And similarly, Masor Zechonot. You can't have less than that. That's the big number. You're supposed to have, this is the first opinion. You have to have 10 for talk about God's kingship, 10 verses. By the way, for one of our 10th verse for kingship is Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. That God, Hashem is one, that He's the one and only. That is a verse that's kingship. You're the one. You're the only God. You're our God. Oh, that's even though it doesn't mention the word kingship in it, but that most of the verses mention the word king in it. But here, sometimes you don't have to even mention the word by saying that He's the only God. That is a sign of, that is a statement of kingship. So that is a verse of kingship. So we can't have less than 10. The first verse, you can't have less than 10 verses that talk about God's kingship. You can't have less than 10 that talk about God's remember the remembrances of God, like you remembering that Kedah, remembering the binding, remembering the good deeds of the Jewish people going into the desert, and Maser Shafrot. You can't have less. Now we turn the page 32a5. You can't have less than 10 verses that talk about shofar. Now, the im omah sheva mikulam. But if you went ahead and you didn't follow the ideal in life, there's something called the lechatchila, the way you're supposed to do something. In the Hebrew, we're on 32a towards the bottom, about 7, 8 lines from the bottom. There's something called lechatchila, the way you're supposed to do something ideally, and then there's something called b'diavad. If you did not do it the way you're supposed to, do you get credit or you got to do it over again? Did you fulfill your obligation? For instance, a person's supposed to, before you tie your tefillin, you say a bracha, right? And let's give a better example. Before you take the lulav and etrog, you're supposed to say a bracha. What happened? You took the lulav and etrog, and you didn't say a bracha on the lulav and etrog. You did the mitzvah, you took it, you had in mind the mitzvah, you didn't say a blessing on it. You just took the lulav. I shook the lulav for the mitzvah without saying a bracha. You get credit for the mitzvah. You did the mitzvah. You didn't do it the way you were supposed to do it. You were supposed to turn over the etrog, whatever, however, and say a bracha and then turn it back. You're supposed to go ahead and you're supposed to say a bracha before you perform the mitzvah. But you get the mitzvah even if you didn't say a bracha. Is that correct? So here also, but you didn't do it the way you were supposed to. You still can get credit. So here we're saying there's a way you're supposed to have done it. You're supposed to have said 10 verses. But the Tanakama says, but if you said 7, instead of saying 10, you said 7, okay, you yotze. You're gonna get credit for the mitzvah. Why? Why if you said 7, you'll get credit? That means 7 would mean you said 2 verses you opened up with 2 verses from the Chumash, 2 verses from the Navi, two verses from the Ketuvim, and then you ended number 7, you did from the Torah. So you did 7 verses on kingship instead of saying 10. And you did 7 verses on shofar instead of saying 10. Why? Because kinega shivarikiyim. The number 7 is a very big number. By the way, the Midrash says, what's God's favorite number, Adam? 7. God's favorite number is 7. That's why the 7 days to the week. 7, the Torah talks about 7 years to Shemitah, 7 Shmitos to Yovel. The number 7 is God's favorite number. But here we see the Gemara says, what's 7? There are 7 heavens. There's 7 heavens, and then there's the earth. There's down here. When you say the Shema, when you say the word Echad, right? Echad, the Chet of Echad corresponds to 8. There's the idea of 7 heavens. Hashem is one, right? Adam, you heard this idea? Echad, the chet, right? The chet, but the chet, 8, there's 7 heavens and there's 1 earth. Shemayim ba'aretz. Hashem rules over what, Mr. Haber? The heavens and the earth. That's the 7. The Dalet represents the 4 east, west, south, and north, the 4 directions, right? The Dalet. But the Chet, the 8, right, Daniel, is the 8 is the heavens. Yeah. So since you mentioned 7 verses of kingship, and that 7 corresponds to the 7 heavens, which represent God's ruleship over the 7 heavens, that God's creating the 7 heavens. So that is good enough. That is a good enough merit for you to you filled your responsibility. That is the first opinion. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nori Omer, Rabbi Yochanan says, "Hapochet lo yivchot misheva." He disagrees. In this Braita, he says, you don't need a minimum of 10. You could start off. The starting point is 7 verses. He likes the number 7, and he says the 7 is good enough that it's not only good after the fact that you did 7, it's even you're allowed to, if you come to the rabbi, how many verses do I need to say? The rabbi said you could start with 7. If you want to do more, you could do more. But technically, if you want to start with 7, at least this opinion holds Rabbi Yochanan, you could start with 7. Now, even though the Mishnah's understanding of Yochanan ben Nori is that you have to start with 10, but the Braita seems to indicate 7. But what about if you didn't do 7? You didn't have 7 verses that talk about kingship. You did less. What's the minimum? If you did 3, yotza. You are yotze. Now, what's unique about 3? Now, if you say you only said 3 verses, you get credit. What did you accomplish with 3? What's unique about 3 that should work? Because 3 is also, there's something special about 3. Because 3 is Keneged Torah Nevi'im Kektuvim. The fact that you said you said 3 verses, and those 3 verses will correspond to the Torah, the Holy Chumash, 5 books of Moses, and the prophets, and the writings and the Ketuvim. That's a great merit for you to be what to be accepted your prayer. But Amila and others say, you know what the number 3 represent? Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim. They represent the Jewish community, and therefore, if you say, we have 3 matzot on Pesach also. Some, I think, also say represents the Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim. If you went ahead and you said 3 verses of kingship, instead of saying 10, instead of saying 7, you said 3. That 3 is a special number, and that would make it successful. Now, what does he mean when he says this statement? If you said 3 from each one, if you said 3, you are yotze, right? So what does he mean when he says if he said 3? So if you're going to say, now he says this opinion says you need to say 7, right? Says you need to say 7, and if you didn't say 7 and you said 3, you have to fulfill your obligation. What does he mean when he says you need to say 7? Does he mean to say you need to say 7 verses from Nevi'im, 7 from Ketuvim, 7 from Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and Chumash, which would mean a total of 21 for each one? What does he mean when he says 7? You mean you need a total of 7 for kingship. Now, till now, we never had anybody saying you need more than 10 verses for any of the ones. Let's talk about kingship. We said until now, there's no opinion that we found that said you said more than 10 verses for kingship. The question is, if you said less than 10, if you said three verses are yotze. If you're going to understand the word 7 to mean if you said you need to say 7 within kingship, you need to say 7 from the Chumash, 7 from the Navi, 7 from Shofar, 7 from the Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and Chumash, That means he's saying you need 21 verses for kingship if you're going to learn that. And we never had that. So obviously, when he says if you need 7, he doesn't mean 7 from Torah, 7 Nevi'im, 7 Ketuvim. He's coming to say less than the previous rabbi, right? The first rabbi says you got to do 10. He said, no, you could do 7. So, and the first rabbi says 10 total for kingship. So the second rabbi, when he says 7, he means a total of 7 for kingship. And then he says, if you do less than a total of 10, you do 3, it's good. So it's clear that the 3, when he says 3, he means a total of 3 for kingship, not 9. Not the Gemara had the question before, if you recall. A little tough little point in the Gemara to clarify. This answers the Gemara's original question. The Gemara's original question was, when he said in the Mishnah, if he said 3, you would say, does 3 mean a total of 3 of kingship, the Gemara said? Or does 3 mean 3 from the Ketuvim, 3 from the Chumash, 3 from the Nevi'im, Ketuvim, which you have to do a total of 9? The Gemara now is proving he cannot mean 3 from the Nevi'im, from Chumash. He can't mean that. He means a total of 3. A total of 3 for kingship would mean 1 verse from Chumash, 1 verse from Navi, and 1 from Ketuvim. Because if you're going to say he means 3 from each, it comes out that when he says a minimum of 7 means 7 from each, which would mean a total of 21 on kingship, and that can't be because he's coming to say less than the previous rabbi. And the previous rabbi said you only say 10 on kingship. So that's what the Gemara wants to say. The Gemara wants to say it's clear that he holds the second rabbi opinion is there's a great difference between the first rabbi and the second rabbi. The first rabbi said you need to have 10 verses on kingship, and the 10 verses on kingship will be from Chumash. The 10 will be made up from Chumash, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Like we said, 3 from Chumash, 3 from Navi, 3 from Ketuvim, and then the last one from Chumash. But this opinion says you don't need that. This opinion says at least at the end of the day, she said 3 total, 1 from Chumash, 1 verse from Chumash, 1 verse from Navi, 1 verse from Ketuvim. At the end of the day, if you only did that, you get credit. And the Gemara said, now we get to conclude the Gemara over here. Amar Rav Huna, before we get to the new Mishnah, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Shmuel, Halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The halacha follows Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that if you only said a total of 3, 1 from each one, you get credit. Okay. You never knew there was so much discussion on the verses that you say on the Musaf. See, we say the verses, we don't realize there's so much background. Here Asaf, so much going on, and the importance and the number of doing it, of how much you have to go ahead and say. Now, the Gemara now says we just spoke about, the previous Mishnah spoke about, we mentioned verses of kingship that we just mentioned, verses of shofar. Well, what type of, now you'll find different verses throughout the Torah, the Nevi'im, Ketuvim that discuss kingship or shofar. But some of them discuss punishment. So the Mishnah states, Emas kirim shel paranil. You don't mention verses of zikaron God remembered when the remembering has to do with punishment, because you don't want to mention something that has to do with punishment on Rosh Hashana. So therefore, even if you find a verse, God uses a word of shofar, connects it with punishment, or reuses with his kingship. He uses a verse that talks about God's kingship, but it used the kingship verse is connected with a punishment for punishing. The Mishnah says that's not what you're supposed to use on Rosh Hashanah. When the Kohen Gadol, when the high priest goes into the Fnai Ulifnim, when he goes inside to the Holy of Holies, what kind of color, what garment? He takes off his garments that have gold and he puts on white called Big Day Lavan. Does not wear any of his gold. He has the headband called the tzitz, made out of gold, right? And it has words that says holy to Hashem. That's what's said on his headband. And he has to take those the 8 garments of the Kohen Gadol, and a number of them contain gold. He has to go ahead and like the Choshen, and you have to remove those things that have gold, and he has to go ahead and put on 4 garments that are white garments, no gold. Why no gold? Because gold has a connection to the Egel HaZahav, to the golden calf. And therefore you don't want to bring, you're coming to serve as a defense of the Jewish people. So you don't want to bring in something that has something that could prosecute the Jewish people, right? So you don't go in with the gold garments onto the Holy of Holies. So certain things you got to be sensitive to. So here also, you're talking about God's, you're talking about, that's why some people don't eat, by the way, walnuts on Rosh Hashanah, right? Why don't people eat? Because egos, the gematria, the numerical of egos is 21, right? And or egos, or chet. Chet is sin, egos, the aleph is 1, the gimel is 3, is 4, and the vav is 6, is 10, and the zayin is 17, and chet, and the word chet, sin, chet is 8, chet is 9, 8 and 9 is 16 plus the aleph, right? Once again, 9 and 8 is 17. So that's, we don't want to do something that equals the egos, the things. So certain things we might want to stay away that connects with certain bad omens, so to speak. So therefore, he says that we go ahead. We don't want to mention verses that discuss that connects with punishment on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. So therefore, the Mishnah, it's a bad sign. Like we said, we have pomegranate morning, Rabbi. We do certain things, certain foods that we eat. We have fish, we should be fruitful like the fish. Morning, we other things we do, it should be a good sign. So therefore, it's not a good sign if we mention verses morning that deal with punishment, even though it talks about God's kingship. Even though it talks about God's kingship, but if it's connected with punishment, we don't want to say that. So that's what the Mishnah states. Kirim shel. You do not go ahead and mention verses that mention punishment, even though those verses connect with shofar, connect with kingship, connect with zachronot, but if it has to do with punishment, you don't want to mention it. Then the Mishnah says another point. Matril b'Torah. The pasuk, the first pasuk, whenever you start, let's say you're talking about God's kingship, what is the first pasuk you're supposed to mention? Supposed to talk with the pasuk. The first pasuk is supposed to come from the Chumash, from the 5 books of Moses, 5 books of Moshe. That's the first pasuk. That's where you start with. And umashlim, and you're supposed to conclude b'Navi. You're supposed to conclude with a verse from the Navi. And why is it in that order? So Tosfos says that the way that the 24 books, the 24 books, the 24 Tanakh are written, that you have Ketuvim, after you have the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, it ends with the death of Moshe. Starts with Yeshua, right? We read the Haftorah about Yeshua. But then you have, as time goes on, you have David HaMelech writes Tehillim. Shlomo writes Mishlei, right? The Ketuvim were written, the order was Torah. Then things that fall into Ketuvim, some that are under kind of writings, preceded some of the Nevi'im, preceded Chagai, Yonah, Zechariah. These prophets came later. A lot of these prophets at the end of the first temple. David HaMelech and his writings, and Shlomo HaMelech David HaMelech lived right before the building of the first temple. Shlomo HaMelech was at the building he built the first temple, the first Beit HaMikdash. And since the writings of the Ketuvim, some of them started earlier than the Nevi'im, so therefore because of that, they were given. That's why the Mishnah says you should first have Chumash, and then you should go ahead and then you do the Ketuvim, then you do a pasuk from the Ketuvim, and then you conclude with a pasuk from Navi. From Matchil b'Torah u'mashlim b'Navi. You conclude with a verse from the Navi. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi says, Im hishlim b'Torah, if you concluded with Torah, a verse from the Torah, yotza. You fulfill your obligation. Even though the first opinion says that you're supposed to end with the Navi, but it comes Rabbi Yossi and he says, he says you don't have to, if you did not end with the Navi, you did not end with a verse from Navi, rather you ended a verse from the Torah, you fulfill your obligation. And we're going to see in the Gemara that we're going to see in the Gemara more about this, that maybe really it's even ideal, it's better to go ahead and end with a pasuk from the Chumash. And that's what we do. We end with a pasuk from the Chumash. So now the Gemara says, now we turn the page. Mabruk, turn the page. 32b, 1. We mentioned that we should not mention verses that deal with punishment. We should not mention those verses, even though they might mention the word shofar, they might mention the word kingship, but it's not appropriate to use a verse, even though you need to say verses of kingship of God. But if the verse that discusses the kingship of God, God's kingship, has to do with punishment, it's not appropriate. So the Gemara gives examples. Where are examples of verses that mention punishment that are not appropriate, even though they mention kingship? So the Gemara says, Kigon, pasuk in Yecheskel, Chayani, Hashem says, Imlo b'yod chazaka, it says, if it wouldn't be, what's going to happen, there's a prophecy, b'yod chazaka, b'zonetuya b'chima, shkufa emloch aleichem. There's a prophecy that said that, when the people are going to shape up, when is God going to rule over the Jewish people? After God's going to have to go ahead and show great anger to the Jewish people, when the Jewish people, Hashem is going to have to rule with power, punish the Jewish people, and as a result of punishing of the Jewish people, they're going to be redeemed after they got the punishment. So that talks about God's going to rule over us. So it's talking about God's punishing us, but it's talking about His ruleship. We don't want to use that pasuk, because since that pasuk talks about punishment, it's not we want to stay away from any verse that connects with punishment, even though it mentions God's ruleship. So that's what the Gemara says. And so now, we should be zocher, we should merit very soon that we should have the gula, we should have the redemption. We should not need to have the redemption in a way that God gets angry with us. Rather, we should have a redemption within a way of peace. I want to wish everyone a beautiful, beautiful day. We're back tomorrow. Thank you all for being back. Welcome back, everybody. Great to have you, Daniel.